Hey folks, I'm back with round 8 from my World Open tournament. In this round I was paired against FIDE Master Vincent Tsay, who I've actually played once before. He's a very talented junior. I think he's a World Under 12 champion in the previous year, which is a really serious achievement nowadays. And yeah, in this game I was playing white. I decided to continue experimenting with knight f3, d5, and e3, the so-called e3 poison system. And well, Vincent followed a pretty typical mode of development. He goes for knight f6, c4, e6, b3. This is now the fourth or fifth time I'm seeing this position in the last month or so, so I definitely felt more or less comfortable here. He played b6 again, which was also the move played against me in the previous round that I had played this as white against FIDE Master Turgut. I stuck with bishop b2, bishop b7, knight c3, knight bd7. This is all still following my game. And actually the interesting thing is that when I had played the previous game in round 6 against FM Turgut, Vincent was actually sitting on the board next to us. So he was like observing most of the game and most likely remembered the opening that I played in that game. So I wasn't sure how well prepared he was. I think this was the morning round, and there was a little bit of time to prepare, maybe like 15 minutes, but really not much. Yeah, I wasn't exactly sure what exactly he was going to play either. But when this showed up on the board, I was actually more or less okay with it because I felt like I had already analyzed the previous game and I had some ideas about how to improve and fight for a bigger advantage. So I had no problem repeating the line, takes, d4. Here he plays bishop d6. And this is actually a little bit unfortunate because in the previous games that I had faced this line, I think both of my opponents played a6. Both Turgut and Grandmaster Georgiev started with this move and then put the bishop on d6, castles, and so on. And had this happen again in this game, my plan was to finally play my improvement with g3, where I feel like white can actually pose a lot more problems. I felt like white didn't really get anything in my previous game, or at least shouldn't have gotten anything in the previous game. And I felt like this would be a much better chance to fight for the advantage. Here I just feel like the bishop on g2 is just a better place in this kind of structure, and white has some nice strategic ideas in the long run. But after bishop d6 was played, I really wanted to stick to this same setup. So I wanted to play g3 here. But the problem is, since black hasn't yet committed to a6, then as soon as I play g3, bishop g2, black can go bishop a6 and prevent white from castling, and this might be kind of annoying to deal with. With the pawn already on a6, this isn't a real concern, and white is in time to play g3, bishop g2, but without it is kind of annoying to have to deal with it. So I think I could have just started with g3 right away. I think this position would be playable, and white has some ideas here of castling. One idea would be to play a3, for example, covering the b4 square and then preparing knight e2, and then castles without having to worry about bishop b4 check. It's a little bit slow, so black does have time to create some counterplay of their own here if they want, but I guess nothing in this game is free, so that's kind of how things work out, but at least white will get to castle and still have a pretty comfortable position. Instead of this, I decided to first start with rook c1. My idea was to at least feint at pretending I want to play knight b5 here, and hopefully getting my opponent to play a6, after which I would happily play g3 here, bishop g2, and I'm no longer worried about bishop a6. And if black has to play a5 and bishop a6, then I think this gives white some more options. For instance, I can maybe play a4 and put the knight on b5, and yeah, it's just not as good for black. But instead, black just castled, and he correctly realizes that knight b5 is not really a threat yet because he can just go bishop b4 check. And then after bishop c3, I think black doesn't trade bishops, but can maybe just go back, like bishop e7, for example. Now my bishop is awkward, black is ready to kick my knight away with c6 or a6 next. I think white is just losing time, and I still haven't figured out how I'm going to develop my light square bishop here. So with this not working, I mean, I could just, let's say, transpose to the previous games and just play bishop d3 here, and then after like a6 castles, we would have basically a direct transposition to the previous game. But like I mentioned, I didn't really feel like white got any kind of serious pressure here, so I decided just to play g3 anyway. And even though I knew my opponent would likely want to put the bishop on a6, I felt like white still has a lot of ways of posing problems, and I felt like this was the most ambitious way to play the position, so I went for it. Here my opponent thought for a little while and ends up going rook to c8, and originally my idea was to play bishop g2 here, and then after bishop a6 I was thinking about either a3 first to prepare knight e2, or maybe just knight e2 anyway, with the idea of meeting bishop b4 check with bishop c3, where if black trades bishops, then I think white is totally fine. We can just castle next move, and I think the trade of dark square bishops is certainly in white's favor in this position. And now I have this semi-open c-file, rook will be on c3, queen coming to c2, and I can put a lot of pressure against black structure. So instead of trading, I think black would probably want to play bishop a3 here, just to keep a lot more pressure, and then something like rook c2, knight e4, and now trying to take the dark square bishop, which is a passive piece but still kind of an important bishop from white's point of view, and also just activating the knight and fighting for more counterplay. So I think this would be pretty much unclear. I'm not exactly sure whether white is at least equal here, or maybe even black is seizing some advantage. But with the opponent's rook on c8 already, I figured bishop g2 was my intention, but bishop h3 actually looks a lot better, because here I'm just putting more pressure on black's position. I'm creating this uncomfortable pin against the knight on d7, and I don't exactly think like, okay, this is going to win material for white like in the immediate future, but it is just annoying to deal with, and it does seem like it gives white better dynamic chances in the long run. So yeah, I didn't see a reason not to put my bishop on h3. I just felt like this is more active. Black goes bishop a6, knight e2, bishop b4 check, and I knew I would have a choice in this position between king f1 and bishop c3. Originally, I actually was planning on playing king f1, then somewhere along the way I changed my mind. What I didn't like about this, I mean, it looks very natural just putting the king on g2, is that after black plays the move knight e4, let's say king g2, black has this move f5, and the idea is to then push the g-pawn forward with g5 next, threatening g4, and this is actually surprisingly very difficult for white to deal with. Like, this is just a very strong counterattack. And now the bishop on h3 is potentially very vulnerable. I even have lines like knight f4, g5, and knight takes d5 available, which looks like might be okay for white because we're hitting this bishop on b4, and then the knight will be hitting the bishop on a6. But the problem is that black is just having too many threats of their own. So after g4, for instance, knight takes b4, black takes on h3 with check. I can't take the pawn because of knight takes f2. King f1 is not possible, so king g1 is the only move here. Yeah, this position just looked extremely unclear and frankly just very unpleasant from a distance, even after a simple move like bishop b7. Yeah, I just felt like my rook on h1 is probably going to be stuck here. I don't remember if I really cared that white was up a pawn here or not. It just felt like, okay, my rook is completely trapped here, and it's going to be very difficult to get it out. And yeah, this is just not the position you really want to play when you're trying to win the game. So with this looking very, very dangerous, I actually considered just putting the king on g1 instead, not playing king g2, with the advantage of being able to just pull my bishop back and dealing with any kind of g5 and g4 counterplay this way. And objectively, this was probably the best choice. Here after black plays f5, now knight f4 is a very strong threat because knight takes d5 and knight e6 are both in the position. And then g5, knight e6 is just good for white because g4 is not nearly as dangerous. It's not attacking anything. With check, here black probably has to move the queen, and then white can start taking some material. So black wouldn't be able to play g5 here. Instead, I don't think f5 is such a great move. I think black still has a reasonable position, can play like queen e7 or rook e8, something like this. White still has to figure out how to get the rook on h1 into the game, which is not so simple because the king can't exactly leave the f2 pawn. So yeah, objectively, I think it would be like dynamically balanced. Both sides have their advantages and disadvantages. But yeah, this was kind of the position I was looking to get, and I probably should have just gone for this. But somehow I ended up going for bishop c3. I felt like this kind of keeps things a little bit simpler, and I didn't want to get into such a complicated game as we would have after king g1. Bishop a3, rook c2, knight e4. Now I just castled. So I was willing to give up the dark square bishop here, but at least I get my king castled, my rook on f1. Should have an easier time getting into the game, and I still felt like this bishop on h3 is really annoying for black in this position because it's hard to develop the knight to d7 to a better square. Objectively though, after knight c3, rook takes c3, I think black is totally fine here. Maybe even slightly better after the move c6, which I think is a really nice way to play the position. Just not rushing with c5, but first securing the d5 pawn, preparing the rook to come to c7 and break the pin. From there, the bishop can jump back to d6, the knight can come to f6, and it's very hard for white to stop black from achieving this plan, and once black does, black will just have the pair of bishops, a very solid position, and is probably going to be slightly better here, especially once black is able to get out of the pin. So yeah, that would have been a very nice way to play the position. Instead, my opponent played c5 immediately, which I actually don't think is a bad move, but it does force black to follow up in a really accurate way. Now it's not so easy for white to find a move here because I'm under some pressure myself. I mean, this pin is very annoying for me, and if I'm not careful, then bishop b4 is going to be an unpleasant move to deal with as well. So rook e1 is not possible because of bishop b4, for example. Eventually, I figured that my only move here is just the somewhat simple move rook to c2, but I think it's also kind of hard to find this move. But I just realized I have no other really useful moves, so all I can do is put this rook on a better square. Now at least I'm not getting hit with bishop b4 with tempo, and I can try the move rook e1 next. If bishop b4, I'll have knight c3, and at least I'm slowly mobilizing and slowly getting my pieces out. Oops. Instead, black played rook c7, which I think is definitely a very reasonable move, just unpinning and hoping to move the knight. And here I decided to play bishop g2. I figured, okay, now the bishop has done its job on h3, time to pull it back to g2. I think this is actually not a great move. It gives black a chance to seize a pretty serious edge. Better would have been d takes c5, just immediately capturing. And black has to take with a piece here. Can't take with the pawn because I think queen takes d5 is working for white. I can just grab this pawn and get away with it. But instead, after dc, knight takes c5, white can play, let's say, knight fd4. And I think white is objectively okay here. It's probably about equal. I ended up going for something like this in the game, but I really should have just done it immediately. Black has good compensation for the IQP just because of the two bishops are really active, but the fact that this d5 pawn is going to be permanently weak is also important to the position. So objectively, I think things are kind of balanced. Okay, instead I decided to start with bishop g2. I didn't really see the problem because if black takes on d4, I'm ready to just take with my knight, and the bishop is going to be better placed on g2 because it can put pressure on this pawn. But what black could have done here is play the move knight f6, which I totally underestimated, because now this allows black to simply take back on c5 with a pawn. And I think hanging pawns are a lot easier to play with compared to the IQP. And here black has two really active bishops. The pawns are well supported, and this is definitely a good version of the hanging pawn. So I think white is just going to be slightly worse here. Or okay, black is extremely comfortable. All the pieces are really active, and white is the one who has to make sure that that I'm not doing anything that allows black to just break through and immediately get a big initiative. So that was a nice move. That would have been a nice find, and I think black would be slightly better there. Instead, black played rook e8, which I think is very natural, but it does give white the chance, a second chance, which I now take, to take on c5. Again, black can't play bc here because if queen takes d5, so black is forced to take with a piece. Here it takes with the knight to defend the d5 pawn. But now I get to play against the IQP, and at least white has some strategic advantages as well. So I play knight fd4, black played knight e4, and yeah, here I was thinking for a while because I really couldn't figure out what to do, because it's yeah, still hard for white to mobilize here. The rook on e1 is getting hit with bishop b4. The knight on e2 can't move. It's hard for the queen to move because any queen move like queen b1 allows bishop d3. So yeah, I was actually finding it difficult just to find a useful move for white. And then I noticed a tactical opportunity that turns out to not only solve all of white's problems, but also starts posing a couple problems to black. So I was very, very fortunate that I had this resource in the position. Might be a good time to pause the video and try to find it yourselves if you're interested. White to play and actually start fighting for the initiative. Okay, so the idea was to take on c7, queen takes c7, and then white has this surprising move b4. Yeah, I don't remember how exactly I found this during the game. I spent a lot of time in this position looking for a lot of options, and eventually I just started checking all kinds of random ideas, and all of a sudden I noticed that this was kind of possible and interesting because I'm threatening queen a4, which all of a sudden targets 3 hanging pieces in black's position. And once you notice that something is possible, then you immediately get excited and you start checking all the lines. And I think the hard part is already done, just kind of noticing that this idea is available. And yeah, unfortunately for black, these pieces are just hanging in the position, seemingly out of nowhere. And queen a4 is a very annoying threat to deal with. White also wants to play b5, kind of shutting down the light square bishop, securing the c6 square. So if black plays something like queen e7, which I think would be defending the rook and preparing to meet queen a4 with bishop takes e2, where black is probably going to be okay, white can play b5. The bishop has to go back, and now I think white has a very comfortable version of playing against the IQP because black's pieces no longer have that activity, especially the light square bishop is going to be a very passive piece here. And it's very nice for white that I've kind of secured the c6 square for my knights, because the knight can one day show up there and it can be very, very unpleasant for black with the second knight jumping into d4. So I think already there white would have a clear edge. Instead, after b4, my opponent ended up playing bishop takes e2 immediately, which I think was the only good move. Another idea, for example, knight c3 was possible as a kind of counterattack. But after knight takes c3, if black takes on c3, then queen a4, and there's simply no way to defend everything in black's position. If instead black takes on f1 here, grabbing the rook, white has another in-between move, knight takes d5, hitting the queen, and then next white will take the bishop, or play queen a4 if it's still a good double attack, and white will be winning 2 minor pieces for the rook, might have an extra pawn as well, and totally winning position. So okay, bishop takes e2, this was absolutely the only move, just immediately solving the issue of one of the hanging pieces and just trading it off. But this is of course in white's favor because black is giving up the bishop pair and giving up a lot of the pressure that black had in the position. So I play knight takes e2 here, bishop takes b4, and queen a4 here is going to be met with queen e7, and I don't think white has any good follow-up, so instead I decided just to take back the pawn, queen takes d5, and after knight f6, queen b3, bishop c5, we can kind of evaluate things here. The position has changed quite a bit, completely opened up. Black did manage to trade off their IQP, so that's kind of a small strategic achievement for them, but in the meantime had to give up the bishop pair, so now black no longer has any real strategic advantage. Objectively, I actually felt like if anyone is better here, it should be white, and that the position was rather unpleasant for black to hold. I think this was maybe a little bit optimistic overall because objectively black should be totally fine here. But my thinking was that with positions with opposite color bishops, the side that can better utilize the bishop is usually going to have a pretty significant advantage here. And in this case, I think it's white's bishop that actually has more potential, mainly because of the structure. I have 4 versus 3 on the king side. In particular, the f2 pawn is extremely secure here. Black has no pressure against that. But if one day I'm able to, let's say, trade the knights on the d5 square and bring the bishop to d5, eventually park it on b3, from there I can maneuver my queen and rook to try and target the f7 pawn, and it's a very, very long-term plan, but it is pretty straightforward, and it's hard to imagine how black will be able to defend against it. Usually the side that kind of has this nagging initiative is very comfortable here, and yeah, I was already kind of anticipating playing some kind of long, drawn-out game where I'm able to just put some very, very slow pressure, but I think in general this type of situation is unpleasant for the defender because you simply have to defend the whole game. Maybe he's able to, let's say, defend the f7 pawn enough times, but at a certain point white is probably going to be able to start pushing f4, e4, e5, start pushing the kingside majority, and looking for some kind of breakthrough. So it feels like it's going to be a very long grind, but with me being on the pressing side, of course, I had no problem with playing a long game. I feel like these kinds of situations are always more unpleasant for the defender. So long story short, I was feeling pretty optimistic here, and I played knight f4. Black played queen e5, and yeah, originally my intention in this position was to just trade the knights off because it seemed kind of inevitable. Maybe it would make sense to keep more pieces on the board to try to put pressure, but with queen e5 on the board, allowing another option, knight d3, I also stopped and took this one very seriously because I realized, well, I can trade off the knights, but I can also just play knight d3 and take black's bishop and get a situation where I have bishop versus knight, with my bishop being a really, really strong piece and undoubtedly a better minor piece against black's knight. Yeah, so actually I had a long think here trying to figure out, which minor piece exactly I want to trade off. Eventually I decided I should go ahead and grab black's bishop, because I just felt like, okay, in this situation, I think in both cases I have a lot of chances to put pressure, but at least with bishop versus knight, I'm definitely not afraid of going for the endgame here, as I probably would be in a position with opposite colored bishops where I would feel like the endgame would be extremely drawish. Here with bishop versus knight, I think basically all endgames are playable. Rook and bishop versus rook and knight, or simply bishop versus knight, would offer white some chances as well. So I just felt like in a practical game, this kind of situation would give me more chances in the long run. Okay, so we end up maneuvering quite a bit here. My idea was to just poke and prod around as much as I could with the queen. The bishop on g2 is controlling this whole diagonal, and so it's not so easy for black to play the position. In particular, the knight on f6 is kind of passive, can't really utilize the e4 or d5 squares. And if black does manage to bring the knight to d7 and c5, then this knight will be kind of far away from the king side, and maybe white can maneuver the bishop to c4 and again start putting pressure on that f7 pawn. Objectively, I think the position should be very close to equal and holdable for black, but in a practical game, just feels easier to play white here. Okay, so we played the next phase of the game relatively slowly, just kind of slowly trying to improve the position. I played king g2, queen c5, queen d3. Black was just kind of going back and forth here. This is another reason why it's hard to play black in this position. From white's point of view, I can kind of make some advancements on the king side, like h3, g4, or h4, maybe one day e4, f4, e5. But for black, it's very hard to push any pawns, because as soon as black touches the a pawn, then the b6 pawn will be a very serious weakness. Moving anything on the king side for black seems very dangerous, because this will likely just create further weaknesses. So it's always nice when you can make pawn moves, but your opponent just has to keep moving their pieces back and forth, because it can be a very, very frustrating way to play the position. Okay, so queen c7, queen a6. Here I found the move rook c4, maybe trying to take control over the c file. And Yeah, my main idea was to try to organize some kind of infiltration. If I could bring my rook to c6, maybe queen to c4, play rook c7 at some point, I thought this would be nice. Although even that would not be such a huge achievement for white, because black can put the queen somewhere on d6 or e7, play rook to d7, and hold the 7th rank using this kind of setup. That said, when you're playing a position where you're slightly better, I think the point is not to try and figure out how you're going to break through, because a lot of times there's no direct breakthrough and objectively the position is a draw. So, if your opponent defends like a computer, then you're just not going to win the game. So instead of looking for some kind of direct breakthrough that might not be there, I think a better thing to do is just to try to pose little problems and do what a lot of players call asking questions, where you attack something and you see how your opponent is going to defend it. Maybe they have 3 different ways of defending a pawn, but only one of them is actually good and the other 2 are awkward and might lead to some other concessions. Or you might just simply start moving back and forth and seeing how your opponent is going to be shuffling their pieces. In some positions, it can be very difficult to shuffle, because you move the queen to a wrong square and all of a sudden you can no longer defend the pawn on a7, for example. So it's I think it's this phase of the game is more of an art and less of a science. It's just a matter of trying to pose little problems to your opponent and seeing if you can find some kind of crack in their defense. I can't say I really played this part of the game well. I feel like a stronger player would have been able to pose much more problems than I did. In fact, the endgame that we end up getting is objectively drawn. So a lot of this maneuvering did not really amount to a whole lot. At this point, black played the move knight h7, now trying to at least maybe get some counterplay with knight to g5. I decided I wasn't really able to get anything with all 3 pieces on the board. A move like rook c7 is met with rook d7, and there was no natural follow-up here. So I decided it was time to trade queens with queen e4. My opponent took on e4, bishop takes e4, played knight to g5. I think this is a good move, and I decided to put my bishop on c2 here. So here I decided to try again. Okay, now I have rook and bishop versus rook and knight, and historically, this is supposed to be a good combo for me. The rook and bishop are usually able to coordinate better, especially in endgames where there are pawns on both sides of the board. For example, a dream scenario would be to get the bishop to b3, rook to c7, and black would have a lot of weaknesses to defend. But here black is just in time to defend against this with putting the knight on e6, which I think is absolutely correct. Now it's very hard for me to get to the 7th rank. The bishop will still be good on b3, but it'll be hard to do anything without the rook getting to that 7th rank. So here I decided to play rook c8 check. I didn't really see another choice. And I was mainly expecting king g7 here, where my plan was probably just to play bishop b3 and just continue the game from here. Again, objectively, I felt like it's probably holdable for black, but at least white can still ask some questions and pose some problems. But I think I was definitely optimistic about this. I mean, objectively, Stockfish feels like black really has no problems. Like almost any move is holding for black. But I don't know. I still feel like in a practical game, it's easier to have the bishop in this kind of situation. Even though the knight has a nice square on c5, the problem is there's weaknesses on on both sides of the board, and well, the bishop is better at handling this kind of situation. Instead, actually, after rook c8 check, my opponent did not play king g7 and just decided to play the immediate rook d8, which I really wasn't expecting. I had thought a little bit up to this point about like this kind of endgame with where we trade rooks and we just have a pure bishop versus knight. I didn't think it really offered many drawing chances for white, but I did feel like if I'm able to at least bring my king in some more active and maybe cross the fifth rank, then it could be really unpleasant for black, because I'll already have one advantage. The bishop is better with situations with pawns on both sides of the board, and if I have an active king, this will be kind of a second advantage in the position, and that might be enough to actually start playing for something. So I decided just to trade rooks, and I felt like I might not get a better chance to do this because currently black's king is a little bit, I think, has a little bit harder time of getting into the game. But then I decided against king f3, which turns out to just be the right move. So here the problem for black is if black just tries to get the king in, then white is basically first. King e4, king e7, king d5. Now my king has kind of crossed the center, so I'm more active here. And I think this is actually a really unpleasant position for black already here. Black has to be very careful not to let the king into c6 and b7, but he also has to be careful not to let the king in through e5 and f6. So now I have two potential weaknesses to target. The bishop is of course coming to b3, and I have a lot of pawn moves to make. I can just push f4, e4, h4, g5, e5, and in the meantime black is going to have to keep maneuvering with the king and knight. And I think objectively it's a very unpleasant situation to be in, because once the white king can get in, it can be pretty much over right there. But after king f3, the move I didn't like was the response knight to e6. Because here if I keep going forward with king e4, well then knight g5 check is going to be winning the h3 pawn. And I definitely consider this line quite seriously, because this is a situation where when we have bishop versus knight, we do want to get involved in a race type situation, because in a race where we're trying to queen our a pawn and black is trying to queen the h pawn, the bishop is always going to be favored in this situation, for the simple reason that when the bishop is sitting on the long diagonal, it is not only defending against black's pawn from promoting, but it is also supporting our own pawn to promote, whereas black's knight cannot do both functions at once. It either has to help its own pawn promote, or it has to be all the way on the queen side trying to defend against the a pawn. So I definitely considered a situation like this where I'm simply just trying to pick up the queen side and basically just rely on my a pawn to win the game. But concretely, it looked like black is just going to be doing extremely well here. Number one can just take on f2, and not only is he hitting the g4 pawn, but he's also hitting the e3 pawn after that, and then even the bishop after that. So it seems like black's knight is just taking everything with a tempo. Now this doesn't always happen. Sometimes your opponent takes the pawn. For example, if the knight grabbed some pawn on g2, from there it would be very difficult for black to really attack anything, and the knight would be extremely awkward. And so with the knight on g2, I would probably be very interested in going for this position, because even though white is a pawn down, it's just a concrete race, and my king is very close to grabbing two of black's pawns. And again, if I get a passed a pawn versus a passed h pawn, with such an active king and good bishop, I think I'm probably winning that race. But here concretely, it just felt like black's knight is too good. Once it takes on h3, it's now threatening to take everything. Okay, I can consider moves like f4 here or f3, but it just seemed like a little bit too much, a little bit too slow, because my king is still very far from even taking the pawn on a7. So I didn't really like this line with king f3, knight e6. I considered the move h4 here, which is kind of the natural second choice, because this covers the g5 square and prepares to get the king in. And yeah, I wasn't sure about this one. Objectively, I think it's much closer to a draw than it is to a white win. White can still pose a lot of problems. I don't think it's an easy position for black to hold, but after g5, for example, let's say knight takes, king f4, black has knight h3 check, which is one resource, hitting the f2 pawn, king g3, knight g5, and just keeping the knight active, preventing white's king from getting in. And I don't think it's such a big deal that black kind of weakened the pawns here. I think here black's king is going to be very quick to get to d6, knight comes to e6, and I think it'll be really hard for white to pose any kind of significant problems there. That's not the only way to hold the position. I think bringing the knight to c5 and then d7 is also good. After king e4, for example, black might have the move knight f6 check, and then try to just bring in the king to d6 very quickly, and I think here black is getting there in time. So yeah, objectively this was actually, I think, the best way according to the computer, but to me it looked like more or less a draw, so I was hoping to try something else. I ended up playing this move f4. I don't think it's a better try, but maybe it poses some unique problems, and I end up catching my opponent in actually a pretty interesting trap. He played knight b7 here, just trying to immediately bring the knight to c5, which I think is very logical, because that is preventing white from being able to activate the king in the fastest way. And that was my plan in this position, just first play f4 to cover the g5 square, and then try to bring in the king with king f3, king e4. but it was probably better for black just to immediately run with the king to the center with king f8. And I think this is pretty instructive because everyone knows that king activity is important in these endgames, but I think even with that, players still underestimate the importance of just bringing in the king as quickly as possible. Because here black gets to d6 first, white isn't able to cross the center, and the king on d4 is not nearly as dangerous, not nearly as active, can always get hit with knight e6 check. And here objectively, I think white doesn't really have much of an advantage at all. Still, I would rather play white in this type of position with the bishop versus the knight, but I think black's drawing chances here are extremely high. Okay, so knight b7, I think this was a little bit in the wrong direction. I played king f3, knight c5, and now I played e4. So I'm still trying to run with my king to the center. Now I want to play king e3, king d4, and king to d5. And of course, if I can get this in and invade with my king to c6, then it's going to be really, really dangerous for black. Even if I have to play king c7 and king b8 just to get to the a pawn, as soon as these pawns start moving, they're going to be extremely weak, and the king will come back and be able to target them really effectively. Yeah, now black has a tough choice, because I think now if he goes king f8 after, let's say, king e3, king e7, king d4, well, this one I think is not quite working, because knight e6 check is still okay for black. King e5 is met with f6, and then black can take the f4 pawn. But I think white can get at least a small advantage here, maybe with pushing e5. And then playing king e3, and basically keeping black's king very restricted. If king e6, I think white can go king d4 here, and then we're threatening to push f5. And if white can get f5 in, then we're going to be able to get king d5 in, and then the king is starting to become dangerously active. So I think this is a little bit dangerous for black. So the best move, according to the engine, was the move f6, which kind of curbs white from being able to play e5 so easily. Here, if white plays e5, then black will take this one. And I think this pawn is not going to be that strong. It's very hard to push it for white. And as long as black doesn't lose the g-pawn, should be doing okay here. I think just king f7, and I think black is doing more or less fine. Instead, I can try like king e3, king f7, and h4, just kind of slowly pushing, but objectively, black's king here is close enough to the center, and king is coming to d6. I'll still try here. I think it's still easier to play white, because I can play like king d4 and e5, and maybe if I can play it at the right moment, the g6 pawn might be hanging. Well, at least according to Stockfish, the position is drawn, though again, practically, it's easier to play white. But that was actually the only move, according to the engine, this f6 idea, to keep the position from becoming critical for black. In the game, my opponent chose the move g5, which looks very natural from black's point of view, just fighting against the bishop on the dark squares. If I take on g5, then after h takes g5, black has created an amazing outpost on e5 for the knight. But I think what my opponent underestimated here was after the move f5, black is simply not really in time to establish this blockade. He played f6 here, I played king e3, and here he went for the immediate knight d7, just trying to plant the knight on e5. Had he gone king f7, for example, and just tried to bring in the king, well, not only can I play king d5 here, but even better is actually just to break e5. So white breaks the blockade, and after the trade of pawns here, white is able to get a very, very strong protected passer on f5. This pawn is going to cause a lot of grief for black. Can push it to f6 very quickly. Bishop can come to g6 or b3. And then one day the king is going to be able to sneak to the queen side and go after the queen side pawns. So this is kind of the principle of two weaknesses at play here. This very strong pawn is one weakness for black, and the a7 pawn is another potential weakness. So I think this situation is very, very close to loss for black, if not outright losing. So in view of this, he decided to play knight d7 and not let white get this e5 break. But the drawback here is that my king is just able to enter in time. And so concretely, this was just the issue. Back here when I played e4 after g5, f5, black was forced to play f6 here, because otherwise I would just play e5 and start gaining a lot of space. And because of these pawn moves, black isn't able to bring in the king in time. And so after knight d7, king d4, knight e5, king d5, everything looks great for black on the king side, but the problem is my king is very quickly running to the queen side, and now black's queen side is extremely vulnerable. So here I started feeling very optimistic, and I felt like the position objectively was probably winning. It turns out black has some nice defensive resources, but they were definitely hard to find. So king f7 was played. I played king d6, knight c4 check, and I didn't like the immediate king c7 here, because I realized, for example, a huge drawing idea that black has is to simply bring in the king as much as he can. King d6, king takes a7, and then king to c7 here, for example. And I wasn't sure what to make of this situation, but it felt extremely drawish to me, because even though white has won a pawn, my extra pawn is the one on e4, which is strategically almost irrelevant. And because I'm not able to make a pass pawn on the queen side, black's king is very secure in a dark square. The knight can just hop between multiple squares and always keep white's e-pawn under control. So this kind of situation felt very, very close to a draw for me. It just seemed like black has basically a fortress. I think the engine evaluates it as something like +1, +1.2 for white because of the extra pawn. But that evaluation indicates that the position is indeed drawn, because if it was winning for white, the evaluation would be much higher. It would be +2, +3, +4, and so on. But since white cannot get more than a pawn advantage here, it basically means that white doesn't have a concrete way to make progress. So during the game, I was able to figure out that I should probably avoid that position, and instead of going for the immediate king c7, I decided to play king d7, which I think is just a better try, because here I'm keeping black's king very passive. If the king moves, then this would allow my king to get to e6, and I think that would be really, really dangerous for black, to let my king become so active. Then there would be a lot of potential for Zugzwang in this situation. But instead, after king d7, black can play knight e5 check. And again, after king c7, king e7, it feels like black is going to be able to get this fortress idea. So I was just trying to figure out the only way I could to pose some unique problems and try to actually break the fortress. So I ended up coming up with this move, king d8. And this one has a very specific idea here, basically making it black's turn again. The knight can't go to c4 anymore because of bishop b3. It's actually not so easy for black to find a useful move. For example, if king f8, then I would put the bishop on b3. And again, the king doesn't have any great moves, because allowing my king to e7 I think would be very dangerous here. If the knight goes to c6 with check, then I play king c7 attacking the knight. And I'm gaining a critical tempo to be able to take the a7 pawn, because here black is not able to play king e7. So if black plays something like knight d4, knight e5 for example, black is simply not in time, and white is going to be winning both pawns on the queen side. So I thought king d8 was definitely a tricky idea, and maybe the best way to pose some problems. Here black ends up playing knight c6 check, which I think is the only move. But now king c7, and so I'm getting to advance my king with tempo. So if knight e5, then I just play king b7, I take, and black is not in time to set up the fortress. Any kind of a move like knight d7 is just met with bishop a4, and black's defense is not going to hold. But instead, black has this move knight d4, which is still holding the position for now, because it's attacking the bishop. And if I play bishop b3 check, then I think black just plays king e7, and again black is in time to set up the potential blockade. Although, yeah, I still can't play e5 here, which would be a really nice resource because of knight c6 check and picking up the pawn. Though it was some line I calculated that was like this, that kind of gave me an idea of how I should play the position instead. Because after knight d4, my bishop is under attack. I decided to play bishop d3 and not bishop b3 check. Black played king to e7. I played king b7 and king d6. So here if I take on a7, king c7, and I go for this e5 break, I've already had this one achievement where black's knight on d4 is not on e5, so it's not on the blockading square, and this gives white some extra options with this e5 break. But here e5 again just doesn't work because of knight c6 check and knight takes e5. But I realized that actually after king b7, king d6, I can play e5 in this position when black doesn't have this knight c6 resource. And that's what I ended up going for. And objectively, even this doesn't win the game for white with best play. I think black is still holding a draw. But it does give black an extremely difficult choice in this position. And my opponent here was already running quite low on time. This is move 63, so we're well past the second time control. And I think he was under 10 minutes here, maybe even under 5 minutes. And yeah, very difficult decision to make, even with a lot of time on your clock, because it requires a lot of just very, very accurate calculation. If you guys would like to treat this as an exercise, I think it's a pretty difficult one, but black to play and save the game, what would you do? Certainly not an easy decision, and I don't think it's one you can really make intuitively, because both king takes e5 and f takes e5 both look really bad. This is just a matter of concrete calculation. So it turns out that f takes e5 does save the game for black, with the very, very key resource in mind. After king takes a7, at first glance it looks really bad because white has created a passed pawn in the position, and we're still attacking this b6 pawn. If black goes something like king c5 or king c7, white just immediately pushes the pawn to f7, and this position is just not going to be holdable for black. For example, knight f8, bishop f5, we're getting very, very close to a zugzwang situation because black's knight has no moves now. The king has to stay in contact with the pawn. Meanwhile, white's king is very, very mobile here, can simply start running towards this knight on f8. I can also use the a4 pawn to distract black's king, and basically the situation is lost. White is going to be winning with the f pawn here. So this looked really dangerous, and I'm sure this is why my opponent decided against f takes e5. But black has this fantastic resource after king takes a7 to push e4. And the point here is that white kind of has to take the pawn, otherwise the pawn becomes too dangerous. And then after knight b5 check, king takes b6, knight c3, it turns out that black is able to win back the pawn on a2. And since black is able to win my distant passed pawn, my outside passed pawn, my protected passer on f5 becomes very, very simple to deal with, as black can now just blockade it with the king. And well, basically, if the knight can get back to the king side, then the position is just going to be completely drawn. White's bishop won't be able to break through. With the knight, white would still be doing very well, but with the bishop that's not able to challenge on the dark squares, white is basically not able to pose any problems here. And yeah, black just barely saves a draw here, like after bishop f3, knight takes a2, king b5, knight c1, king c4. It looks like the knight is almost trapped, but white simply just doesn't have enough resources to trap it. Black can play king e5, and no matter how the king approaches the knight is always going to have some way to get out of the attack. And basically, the knight can escape, and I'm not going to be able to use the extra passed pawn at all. So yeah, I think that was a really hard resource to find, and it just shows the difficulty of these endgames of playing bishop versus knight, where a lot of times the defending side has to make a very, very difficult decision that a lot of players will get wrong. So my opponent decided to play king takes e5, which doesn't allow me to get a passed f pawn, but it does allow me to take on a7, and now black doesn't have a comfortable way of dealing with the hanging b6 pawn. He's forced to play b5 and start pushing the pawn, but the pawn is not going very far. I played king b6, b4, and now a very important move, bishop c4 here. If I continue chasing the pawn with king c5, then after b3, of course I cannot trade off the pawns. This would just give black a very easy draw, so I would have to play a4 here. Then black goes b2, and it already just starts to feel very unpleasant because this pawn is threatening to promote in a lot of lines, and now black has a lot of tricks like knight e2, knight c3. I think it's still very, very concrete because white's a pawn is also really strong. But objectively, I think actually black has enough resources to hold here, and intuitively I feel like this was way too dangerous to go for, especially given that bishop c4 is just a much simpler option, just stopping the pawn on b4, preparing either king c5 or king a5 next to challenge and take the pawn, and yeah, keeping seemingly a lot of winning chances in the position. Again, even if black goes for the kingside pawns here, like with king f4 or something, we'll play king c5, I don't know, knight f3, king takes b4. I think any kind of situation where we're now racing is going to be very, very good for white, because here it seems like the knight is kind of in range to defend against the pawn, but I think generally speaking, against the rook pawn, if the king has some kind of support, like you have a bishop or a knight helping out, you'll always be able to break the blockade of an enemy knight. So if this knight, for example, finds its way to a6, you know, the bishop can just attack it on a light square, or if it goes to a8, the bishop can attack it on a light square. And if it's on a7, then the knight can be dominated and the king can just take it with king c5, king b6. So basically, in the long run, this knight is never able to fully defend against past a pawn or past h pawn. It can only slow you down a little bit, but it's not going to be able to sacrifice itself for the pawn. The pawn will always be able to promote with best play. So something like this, I think white should be winning this one. It looks scary because black gets some pass pawns of their own, but it doesn't matter who has more pass pawns. What matters is who gets there first. And in this case, I think white is going to be getting there first. So king f4 is not really working. My opponent instead chose to move king d6, which I think is a much better try because it stops king c5, and now king a5 would be met with king c5, and that's not going to be good for white at all. But it is very close to a zugzwang for black, which I realized, because if the knight moves away from d4, then I can play king b5 and go after the pawn. So I was trying to figure out how to maneuver my bishop. This is another advantage of the bishops, is that they almost always have an endless supply of waiting moves, and you can pass the turn to the opponent. I should have just played the simple move bishop to b3. Here, if black takes on b3, then it's just a losing king and pawn endgame. White is going to take here and is going to be faster. But if black does not take on b3, then it's hard to find a move. For example, can play knight e2, white goes king b5, knight f4, take on b4, knight takes h3. And then after a very accurate sequence, bishop d1 and bishop f3, white's bishop is now perfectly placed for this endgame. The a pawn is really strong, and black's pawns just can't create enough counterplay. Here it's hard for black to create a passer without allowing white a second pass pawn, and again, the bishop is just much stronger than the knight in this kind of scenario. So this would have been the way to win the game. Instead, I had a similar idea. I played bishop f7 with the point that after black plays the move king e7, which happened in the game, I wanted to drop back all the way to b3. And then in case of king d6, I would play bishop c4 with a nice little triangulation, repeating the position that we just had a few moves ago, but now it's black to move. And either the king has to move or the knight has to move, and both of these options are going to be letting my king pick up the b4 pawn. But after bishop f7, black, of course, did not have to play king e7. Knight e2 was actually a lot stronger here, immediately going after the h3 pawn, where after king b5, knight f4 takes, and knight takes h3, it turns out that black is actually holding this one because white isn't able to put the bishop on f3. So this is the key difference between putting the bishop on f7 or putting it on b3. In this position, I could be able to play bishop d1, bishop f3, and then white would be winning. But here I'm not able to do that. So after king b5, knight f2, I have to play something like bishop h5. And in the game, I thought this would offer me really good winning chances anyway because, well, my pass pawn is running, and as soon as the king goes back to defend it, I'll be able to transfer my king to the king side and go after the f6 pawn. So to me, this looked really good, but concretely, it actually just doesn't work out. Black is able to defend here. So for example, a sample line I was looking at, king e6, knight e4, and I just don't have a good way of targeting the knight. Again, the bishop on h5 is just really badly placed. If the bishop was anywhere else, I could play, let's say, bishop g2 or bishop c2, just attacking the knight safely. The knight would have to move. I would take on f6, and white would probably be winning. Well, yeah, the bishop is just misplaced here, and things are not so simple, and in fact, black is totally fine. So this was a nice resource, and in fact would have saved the game for black with best play. Again, very hard to find this with, like, I think a minute or 2 minutes on your clock, as my opponent had, maybe even less at this point. So yeah, I can't really blame him for not seeing this, but on my end, I should have been a lot more careful, and I should have just found bishop b3 and won the game cleanly. As it turned out, after bishop f7, king e7, bishop b3, knight e2, we essentially end up getting a very similar version of this. Knight f4, I take, knight takes h3, I find bishop d1, knight f2. I could have played bishop f3 immediately here. I decided to play bishop e2, which is also perfectly fine. King d6, a4, king c7, and I decided to start with the king c5. I think maybe a5 would have been another way to win the game, but both moves are good enough. King c5, and now again my idea is to either promote the pawn or run to d6 with my king and take on f6. But here actually I think the pawn is going to be promoting. For example, if black plays, well, the only way to defend it would be to play king b7 and king a7, but this immediately allows me to go after this pawn. And again, we have a much better version of things with my bishop being able to sit on f3 here, a lot more active, and now I'm going to be just winning the game on the king side. Instead, black played knight e4 check. I keep my king in the center, knight g3, bishop f3, and h5. Okay, the only way to create any kind of counterplay. Now white has only one good move, but it's good enough. G takes h5, gaining another pass pawn. This does give up the f5 pawn with check, but white's two distant pass pawns are actually a lot stronger than black's connected passers here, mainly because the knight cannot defend against both of them. The knight has to defend against one, the king has to defend against the other, but black is actually not in time here. King c5, and now after any move, I'm just playing a5, a6, a7, and the pawn is promoting. If black tries to stop with king b8, then I'm in time with king b6. And basically white is just in time here. If black's king was on a7, then this would be a lot more difficult to win, and I'd probably have to start running towards the kingside pawn. But here black's king is actually not able to defend against the a-pawn, and the a-pawn is just promoting. The knight has to come back and help out, but then the h-pawn runs, and so black just is too far stretched. So he played knight h6, I pushed g4, bishop d5. At this point I think almost any move wins for white, but I just keep pushing here, a6, knight d6, and a7. I mean, the only way to try to stop the pawn was king b8 at this point, but then king b6, and the pawn is still just promoting, so nothing to be suggested. Black is just lost. Knight d6, a7, knight b7 check. And now I actually could take on b7 and then just push h6, but I think that would really prolong the game completely unnecessarily. After king d4, black isn't able to stop the a-pawn from queening, and black resigned. So yeah, I was very happy to win this game. I mean, I felt like it was a long fight and a long struggle. I'll definitely say that I was way too optimistic as far as what I thought my chances were in the middle game and endgame. In positions where I thought I was much better, it was closer to equal, and in positions where I thought I was winning, it was closer to just like being a small advantage for white. Sometimes this kind of optimism can pay off in a chess game because it forces you to kind of keep pushing and keep trying to maximize your winning chances. I think I did a good job of that in this game. I mean, objectively, the game was drawn for most of the battle, but by continuing to pose a lot of problems to my opponent, he ended up running low on time, and when he finally had to solve a very difficult question, he simply didn't have enough time to figure it out, and that eventually allowed me to win the game. So with this win, I was on 5.5 out of 8 going into the final round, which I'll be covering in the next video. So until then, take care.